Okay, this is my final project, navigating the new norm, remote work and its impacts on the well-being of businesses and their employees. So table of contents, we're gonna first go over an introduction on what the project is about, and then we're gonna dive into the data and explain all the parts of the data, and then we're gonna go through the analysis, and then we're gonna go through a conclusion to give recommendations. Okay. Introduction. So the occupational world changed after the 2019 COVID pandemic. These changes continue to affect how we operate and interact in business today. The trends towards remote work was already underway thanks to the rise of telecommunications and freelance opportunities. However, the pandemic has accelerated this trend and resulting in a widespread adoption of working from home and its transformative effects on traditional work structures. The purpose of this research is to give businesses seeking to implement a remote/hybrid work policy indications on whether or not this type of policy would be appropriate and successful for providing businesses with actionable insights to inform their decision-making regarding remote work policies and ultimately fostering a more effective and sustainable work environment for both employers and employees. We're going to go into the data now. The data is a survey data from New South Wales with 1,500 remote workers. So they took this data of the survey during the pandemic at different points of the pandemic, kind of one in the peak and then one afterwards. And the goal of this study was to capture the shift in remote work and experiences and attitudes during different stages of the COVID pandemic. So about the data, just looking at it as a whole before diving into analyzing it, the surveys were mainly comprised of strings, how the survey responses were set up and everything was strings or floats. So many of the questions prompted respondents to answer off of given categories from multiple choice to Likert type scales. And the questions that was made was remote related and more focused on remote working than it did on like office work, like working in office or comparing that. And then in 2021, there was an additional 30 questions, and they focused a bit more on management perceptions than they did in 2020. And both of the datas are practically the same. They have very similar questions, and but there was changing to wording uh, and there was also additional questions added to the 2021 survey. Also, the time frame for past comparisons was altered. So, for example, in the 2020 survey, the questions referred to the previous year or the 3 months prior to taking the survey. And in 2021, the time frame was changed to the last quarter of the previous year in the past 6 months. So before analyzing, I'm cleaning the data. So I decided to condense the column names. Originally, the raw data set, the columns were all questions. They were strings. So I had to shorten those up a bit. So what I did was just give them new names that gave us a general idea what the questions were, and removing punctuation and spacing from the column names and adding underscores and dashes to make up for that. And that is also just for being able to recall the column names and identifying the same columns from multiple data sets. And then dropping columns. In the 2020 survey, there were a couple of duplicate columns So for example, there was an industry column and then an industry detailed column. They were basically the same thing except more in depth. So I dropped the columns and stuck with the basics. And also in 2021, there was it was the same thing with pay cut availability. And also, that one had over 65% of missing values, so I decided to drop that completely from that survey. And then also replacing missing values. So I either replaced the float responses with zeros or the string responses with not available. And then merging columns, categories in a column. So for example, the gender category, they had 3 different options other than male and female. They had 2 that were essentially the same thing, prefer not to say, and then the other one was, like, worded differently, and then the 3rd option was other, so I decided to combine those categories to enhance representation since there was such a low frequency in the responses to those categories. And it also simplifies the data, and analysis, but we'll still be able to recognize, the gender diversity with including just the 3 instead of like 6 different categories. And it was the same thing also with household description, where there were multiple categories that are basically the same, so I combined them. Also, I changed the data types. So as I said before, initially these were all strings, and some of the responses were a mix of words and numbers. So I dropped so for example, the productivity hour column asks how productive you are each hour, and the responses were something along the lines of, I'm 50% more productive or 50% less productive. So, and then the rest were like just numbers, so like 10%, 20%. They only did it for a couple, so what I did was removed the additional descriptive labels and just left the numbers, and I turned those object data types into floats. And I did that by using regular expressions to extract the numerical value from the string and then converting it to a float. And then I also realigned the index. So when I initially merged the 2 data sets, the response IDs didn't come out as expected. It was all really messed up. And this is due to that both the tables had their own sequence of response IDs, and merging them, they didn't align properly. So I realigned the response IDs by creating separate sequences for each year and then merging the tables based on similar columns together. And then I set the response ID as the index. And then I re-uploaded the newer versions of these of the 2020 and 2021 surveys before continuing on to merging them. So going into the analysis, we're going to go over demographic and industry, productivity and time use, mental health and overall well-being, and business perceptions. So for demographic and industry, exploring demographics can be very useful for an employer to tailor their policies to meet the specific needs of their employees based off the preferences of different demographic types. So for example, if you have employees that are really old, and then you also have really young, like teenagers working, there's a difference in their needs that needs to be met. So knowing who is working for you is really important, not only for just to implement policy, but to implement like a good working environment. Knowing who's working for you is also a personal thing. So so this is demographic information from the New South Wales surveys for 2020 and 2021 combined. So we have about the same amount of respondents for male and female. There's also the 0.20 that refer to others. So you can see why I dropped the other two and just combine that into other because it's relatively very, very small. And I could honestly have dropped the other as well, but I wanted to recognize gender diversity. Um, then I also did a distribution of general age groups and remote workers. So originally, the age column was based off of the birth years from 1900 to 2012. So I decided to combine them into generational cohorts, and I think it's easier to identify with, and I think it's easier to identify the like age numbers than actual birth years. That's a bit of math. And I grouped them from Silent Generation, which is from 1928 to 1945, but I did include the people that were born before that because those were the only two people really that was in that category. So just to make things easier and not make a whole nother category from on that. And then I did baby boomers, which is from 1946 to 1964. Gen X, which is born between 1965 and 1980. Millennials or Gen Y were born between 1981 and 1996. And Gen Z, which were born from 1997 to 2012. And then I also took a look at, they also took a look at whether or not people lived in rural areas or big cities. About 78, almost 79% lived in bigger cities and 21% in rural. And I feel like as soon as if remote work keeps going the way it is, keeps trending upwards, that rural areas will definitely grow more. We'll definitely see a bigger number with more people in rural areas working remotely, and it just makes sense as well. But they also looked at household descriptions. So the most popular or the most people that worked in the surveys were couples with children or without children and single people. So I did a analysis on age group. I wanted to figure out if how old you were affected attendance in the office. So I did that with 2020 and 2021. Remote work increased, remote work participation increased in 2021 by 39% of people working. 20% of remote work counts as one working day. So you can see that there's a lot more people working multiple days a week remotely. And, instead of solely working remotely in an office, most people opted in for hybrid working, which is about 2 to 3 days a week out of a 5-day work week. And we can also see a jump in Gen Z numbers from 2020 and 2021. And like I said, and from before the age groups, there was mainly focused on the millennials and Gen X, as well as a little bit of the baby boomers, but the boomers are getting smaller as they are going into retirement and leaving the workforce as Gen Z is coming into the workforce. And you can see that in these charts that there is a big jump or a bigger jump. So then I compared the household descriptions with age groups, and it comes out to Gen X and Gen Y with as couples with kids or couples with no kids. And then there is Gen Z, which is pretty small, but there most likely will grow bigger. And the survey of working arrangements and attitudes on March 2024 actually shows that 46% of 20 to 29-year-olds, Gen Z, are working from home and participating in hybrid working, where only 40%, 40 to 49-year-olds, which is about like Gen Y or a little bit Gen Y and Gen X mixed, about doing the same thing. So obviously there's a huge jump with Gen Z coming into the workforce now. And I identified the top 3 industries that participated in remote work the most was professional, technical, and scientific industries, as well as financial and insurance, and education and training. And these top industries had over 500 companies report that they have more than 200 employees working for them. So bigger companies usually participate in remote work. So going into productivity and time use, examining productivity is a huge thing, a huge factor in considering whether or not to implement a policy on remote working. It gives businesses clear insight into setting realistic goals and expectations for their remote workers, and mitigating risk that are involved in remote working, as well as knowing the barriers of remote working. And when looking into the factors to remote work barriers, both surveys provided the same factors, um, except for an additional 2 questions in 2021, which asked about additional costs as a remote barrier and the health and safety of the workers while they were working remotely. And I decided to exclude those 2 just so the questions would be the same, for the sake of uniformity. So remote work barriers goes from the organization's software and systems, feeling left out or isolated, poor management, connectivity, difficulty collaborating remotely, tasks that can't be done remotely, their living situation or working environment, lack of motivation, cybersecurity, lack of remote working skills, IT equipment, caring responsibilities, uh, the workplace in general, and management discouraging remote working. So in 2020, they asked the respondents, just like the most and least significant barriers to do their work remotely. And in 2021, the surveys asked if those barriers have improved or worsened for them over the past 6 months. So lack of motivation seemed to be the most and the least significant barrier, which is really interesting. This could honestly be due to personal preferences and how people use their time and mental focus when working in the comfort of their own homes and the industry that they work in. A different environment could be a factor in how well you perform. So lack of motivation is a very reasonable thing to feel about that. The top 3 most significant barriers was lack of motivation, difficulty collaborating with others, and feeling left out or isolated. The top 3 least significant barriers were lack of motivation, caring responsibilities, and living situations. So improving in 2021, they asked about improvement of these barriers, and 31% of respondents replied that collaborating with others improved. And this could be just from time passing from the height of COVID and people getting used to working remotely and getting the kinks out of working with the technology and how we communicate in a new working environment. So I think that was just time, a passing of time, which is why it got better. And about the same amount of respondents said that their feelings of lack of motivation stayed about the same, and 24% of respondents claimed that the feeling of being isolated had worsened as time went on and continuing to work remotely, which makes sense. So these surveys also asked respondents to compare their productivity when they work remotely to when they work at their employer's workplace and roughly give a measurement of their productivity each hour. And respondents indicated their level of productivity expressed as a percentage when working remotely. So the negative is considered I am this percentage less productive when working remotely, and the positive numbers refer to them being a percentage more productive when working remotely. Um, and in general, employees think of themselves as being more productive when working remotely. Management seems to also reflect this. And in general, direct management, senior leadership support working remotely. And over 60% of employees report that their organizations even encourage remote working. And then, as you can see, these are the remote working barriers improvements. So you can take a deeper look at that. More people took longer in 2021 to work remotely. 36 to 44% of remote workers spent no time at all preparing for work. 50% of those who preferred working in office spent 1 to 2 hours preparing for work, and less than 3% spent little to no time getting ready. So there's obviously a big difference there. And remote working increased from an average of 36 to 47 hours a week, which is 8 to 9 hours a day. And the remote working spends less time working than those who prefer to work in an office setting. So there is also an increase in 2021 with an additional 10 hours a week working remotely. And this could be due to overcoming barriers and becoming more efficient in their tasks. And although, they spend less hour working, they utilize less personal time during working hours. So this could be more productive than working in office. There are distractions, there are other people that you want to talk to and all that in the office. So that makes sense. The most time spent utilizing personal time for both working environments is around 4 hours total. And there was an increase on time spent on caring and domestic responsibilities during 2021 in both remote and in-person work hours, 12 to 17 hours more than it did in 2020. And I thought this was really interesting. I thought, this could possibly be due to more people having children at the height of the pandemic with lockdowns and isolation in full effects. So, after diving into that a little bit more, I found out that remote workers households increased by 9% from 2020 to 2021. In office increased by 14%. In total, a 23% increase in couples with dependent children. And in 2023, there was a research article that pointed out the 2021 baby bump marked the first reversal in declining fertility rates since the Great Recession. US-born mothers' birth rates fell to 31,000 in 2020, which was on track with a trend that statistical models predicted pre-pandemic, but rose to 40,000 in 2021. And I thought this was interesting because I am a mother myself, and I actually got pregnant during the pandemic. So I think I really connected with that, and I really wanted to figure out if that was true. And just like the baby boomers, this is going to be called the baby bump, I believe. So going into mental health and overall well-being, it's important to take into account an overall well-being of your employees, including their mental health and satisfaction, as it is a positive impact on your productivity. And according to a study from Knoll Workplace Research, they found that the greater the employee's well-being, resulted in lower costs and increased productivity. So in that study, it showed 5% increase in job performance with fewer unscheduled absences, so fewer call-outs. Additionally, there is cost benefits associated with well-being, such as 60% lower medical and prescription costs. So that's saving on the employer side. And, poor employee well-being, on the other hand, can lead to higher turnover rates, increased hours, and a decrease in the employee engagement and morale. So they asked about the best aspects of remote working. Employees voted for the most with work-life balance, working relationships, and opportunities to socialize, which is really interesting because, working remotely, you're usually by yourself working. So I wonder how working relationships and opportunities to socialize played a part in that. And then job satisfaction, managing family responsibilities, and personal relationships were the least voted for. And that's also very interesting. I figured as if you're remote working, you would be a lot, I personally would be a lot happier. And you would be able to have more time to do personal things. But also I could see the fact that, if you're working remotely, there could be a danger into working overtime and being a workaholic. Um, even though the results show this is the case, people could argue that the work-life balance category could encompass the aspects of the other um, categories, such as job satisfaction, managing family responsibilities and personal relationships. So, and overall well-being in general. So I would say work-life balance does cover all that. So, uh, the respondents were asked to rate whether they agreed with certain statements. The statements were related to the well-being and physical activity levels. And out of the respondents, 59% felt better while working remotely, and 57% agreed that they were physically more active when they were working remotely. So going to business perceptions, we're going to take a look at how other businesses and upper management handled their employees while working remotely. It'll give those who want to implement policies some insight into the benefits and costs, as well as popular practices from successful work from home policies. So as mentioned in the beginning, the 2021 survey did focus a bit more on managers' perceptions on how remote work impacted their management and their businesses. So in response to the perception questions about remote work, over half of management in this survey agreed that it benefited them in some type of way. They particularly found it easier to communicate with their employees when working remotely and felt that their team worked well together under these circumstances as well. And, money also plays a big role in deciding whether or not you want to implement a policy and making a big change in your company. Um, According to the Global Workplace Analytics Telework Savings Calculator, they predicted that if a U.S. company could increase their bottom line by 525 to $665 billion a year due to savings in real estate, reduced absences from work, turnover, and increased productivity, all from working remotely. If only half of the company did that, or if they worked half the time remote working, that would be the savings. And this figure could even be higher if they were working full time. 6 out of 10 employers considered cost savings a huge benefit from remote working. But, however, it's important to note that shifting into a remote work environment does cost money as well. It is an investment. Organizations reported that virtual employees are often reimbursed or provided with technology and software, such as computers and things they have to use for work. And some of these costs also roll over to the employees themselves at times if companies decide not to cover those certain costs. And the average cost per worker was $2,710. So wrapping things up, the impact of the pandemic was a turning point for how we interact with one another in a working environment and our point of view on a work-life balance. Surveys like the NSW survey gave many an insight into their own perceptions of their work-life balance, job satisfaction, and productivity. The surveys also gave those who are looking to implement a remote work or hybrid work model in their businesses a deeper understanding of building a successful policy. So, based on all these findings, I have a policy recommendation. If those who decide that remote work is in the best interest for their company after looking through and hearing about the findings, these are the things that would be recommended in placing in in their new policy. So they should consider eligibility in new employees and those who are technologically savvy and in upper management. The more experience you have, and depending on what you do for work, um, upper management would be the most popular choice to work from home, as well as those who are able to work with computers well. And the new employees, it's been a popular trend where if the job does require or have the option to work from home, new employees are eligible, but they are required to work a certain amount of time in office before they do so. Also consider the required software tools that you're going to be using. Consider what will be needed for optimal management and communication between coworkers and clients. And this goes from, project management to communication tools between coworkers. So, and then availability and time management, being able to keep track of when employees clock in and out is really important. So they need to figure out a way to do that. There's obviously plenty of different software available, but if they choose a cheaper route, they have to kind of get that in order. And then productivity management, new productivity measures and consistent follow-up reports should be administered to kind of, at least I guess in the beginning, to implement some type of structure and implement attainable and reasonable goals and set out expectations for like layout and expectation for your remote workers. And then workspace and equipment. So deciding on what equipment the company should invest in or compensate their employees for should be based on, company budget and the employee needs to be successful. And data security is also a new thing that has to be kept in mind. Since employees are having access to company information in their personal environment, there needs to be a measure of data security that is involved when handling companies or clientele information based on the industry. But that is my research project about remote work. All my Python code is in my Colab, and then I also have a zip folder that I am turning in that has a lot of has my visualizations in one folder and then my code in a different folder, and as well as my SQL code as well in there. So thank you.